Good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in our series of alumni webinars. This one's entitled, in the series entitled The Future of Physical Sciences. This one is on accelerating research with AI here at Cambridge. So I'm Dr. James Ferguson. I'm a theoretical cosmologist by training, but I also direct a number of programs, an MPhil and a PhD program in data-intensive science in the Department of Applied Maths and Theoretical Physics. And so this series of webinars was started in 2020. It's a great way to sort of connect our alumni with, stay up to date with their research, but also connect you with our researchers and actually hear directly from them the kind of things that they're doing and the developments that are happening. And I think this series on AI is really really exciting and sort of rich field, right? This is one of the most dynamic sort of areas. As a cosmologist, I remember starting about 20 years ago. And you can still do great research where you publish papers with, 5, 10, 15 data points. You could be friends with them. You can know them all very well. You could sit there for hours analyzing them very carefully. But really the sea change that's happened in science and indeed sort of society in general is the exponential growth in data. And the challenge that this brings is that you have to adapt much more modern methods and different ways of approaching it when you're up to sort of terabytes or petabytes of data. The old ways we like to do things no longer work, but it does open up these new exciting things when you have large amounts of data that you can do really exciting things with AI. And we're seeing how this is really changing all of society. But tonight we're going to hear from 3 expert academics at Cambridge about the way it's changing the way we do research in these areas and the kind of exciting things that you can do when you utilize these modern methods for our scientific problems that we have, right? So the format of this evening is we're going to have 3 talks. We're going to do them all in a row, roughly 12 minutes each. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen throughout. We will collate them all together and then have a full Q&A at the end with all 3 speakers. So please, if you like things in the first talk, don't forget to post questions then, and we'll collect them all up and try and run through a selection of them at the end of the thing. All right. So if everyone's ready and everyone's feeling excited, our first speaker is going to be Dr. Emily Lyons from Geography, and she's going to tell us all about how AI is helping her improve forest monitoring. So, Emily. You might have to unmute.
Thank you. You'd think I'd know by now. So thanks, James, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about how AI is helping us to accelerate our ability to monitor forests around the world. So forests are globally important as a store and a sequester of carbon. They store more carbon than is in the atmosphere. And they're also incredibly important for biodiversity. So around 80% of terrestrial biodiversity relies on forests. But human activity is impacting forests around the world and having very negative consequences on their ability to store and sequester carbon and to provide habitat for biodiversity and livelihoods for people. And these threats come from things like deforestation. So on the left here, you can see an image of deforestation using a satellite to pick it up, and you get this very characteristic herringbone pattern. This is in the Amazon, in the eastern Amazon in Brazil. They're also being threatened by climate change. On the right here, you can see this is a drone image from one of our monitoring sites where those sort of grey ghosty things are trees that are dead or dying because of climate change induced drought. Here in the UK, of course, we have a lot of biosecurity issues in forests and concerns with things like ash dieback, Dutch elm disease, wiping out individual species with these introduced diseases in our landscape. So in order to tackle these kinds of challenges, we really need very robust monitoring. We need good sources of data at high spatial scales, large spatial scales, high temporal scales, and very detailed, that are able to give us the information that we need about how forests are functioning and how they're changing. And traditionally, we have relied a lot on either satellite measurements, which are quite broad scale, or what we can collect on the ground, which is typically people like me wandering around the forest with a tape measure, putting our arms around trees and taking a measurement of the size of that tree, recording the species of it, and using that very basic measurement of the size of the trunk to infer all sorts of things about how trees work and how forests work. And that's very limiting in terms of how many trees individual humans can go and collect, but also about the amount of detailed information we can get. So how much of the tree we can see. If we can only reach the trunk, if that's all we're measuring, then we're quite limited in our understanding. So right now is a very exciting time to be working in forests because there's a plethora of new sensors coming out that give us all sorts of new opportunities for monitoring forests in new ways. So in our group here, we're doing this on the ground using laser scanners on drones using laser scanners. They are eye safe, they're not harmful, they're visible light, so no risk. And also using things like super lightweight consumer drones to take photographs at high resolution. And all of these capture much more information about the forest than we've ever been able to do before. So as an example, this is from a project I'm involved with. This is a single tree measured using what's called a terrestrial laser scanner. So it's also called a LiDAR system. And the LiDAR was placed around the tree, scanned from lots of different angles. And this is millimeter scale accuracy of the full shape of that tree. We can see individual leaves on there, the twigs, the bark, the arrangement of the branches, and we can use these kinds of data, because they're not just pretty images, they're data, to understand things like how much carbon is within that tree, how many leaves are on it, and therefore how much sequestration that tree is doing, the health of that tree, the microhabitat that tree might be providing in terms of the little dents and hummocks in its bark, and so on. So we have access to these incredible data sets because of new sensors, but they are very large. This is the terabytes that James was talking about of data. And unfortunately, when we go out and scan them, they don't come with lots of ecological information that will help us. So this is where AI is really starting to be a very important tool for our research. So this is all about taking these incredibly detailed raw data sets that we get, whether they be point clouds or high resolution images of forests, and processing them to extract the properties that we care about. So things like the biodiversity, the carbon storage, and so on. And AI is really helping us to tackle this very intensive processing step. And in doing so, massively increase the spatial and temporal ambition of our monitoring. So I'm just going to show a few examples from our group of what we've been doing with AI, and then some examples of what we have been able to find out using these new tools that we've been developing. So one of the things that we've been working on is semantic segmentation. So using deep learning AI methods to segment the images, three-dimensional images we get from these scanners into their component material parts. So that's things like leaves, wood, ground material, shrub material, dead wood, and so on. And we care about doing this kind of separation because we want to understand how the whole forest is functioning, and those different components have different roles in the carbon cycle and in protecting biodiversity. So this is work done by my postdoc Harry Owen, and he has been using an architecture called PointNext, where he's been generating probability images for whether material is leaf or wood, and he's particularly interested in these two classes. That allows us to create classifications and then allows us to strip away the leaves. Now, this work happens to be done in a deciduous forest, so we could have just gone and scanned this area leaf off, but the most interesting forests for carbon and biodiversity are evergreen tropical rainforests, where you can't do that. So it is really important that we can work with leaves on and leaves off. And once we have these woody skeletons, as shown here in red, we can then fit hulls or cylinders to them to work out how much biodiversity is in there and do very highly accurate carbon accounting. So this has been shown to be by far the most accurate way of working out how much biomass and how much carbon is stored within a tree. Separating out the woody clouds also allows us to get closer to doing individual segmentation, which is has been a big blocker in our pipelines, because cutting out a three-dimensional image to segment the individual trees is a very challenging manual process. And so again, here deep learning has been a really important tool for us to identify the individuals within the forest and start to understand how they're interacting. Unfortunately, those individuals don't come with metadata. They don't come with little tags on that say which species they are. But again, this is somewhere that deep learning has shown real promise for us. So this is work by my PhD student, Matt Allen. And he has used individual tree point clouds where we know what the species are because we recorded it at the time in the field. And he's used convolutional neural networks, CNNs, to do species identification. And this is a really great task because looking at those individuals, examples of these different species, these are all so Quercus, oak, and Pinus, pine species in Spain, and then juniper. They look visually very, very different. So of course, deep learning is going to be good at this kind of a task. And we demonstrated this for a small set of data, but we're now working with a very large group of researchers across Europe to generate common tools that will do this for all of the major European tree species. Once we can do these kinds of tasks, they enable us to study forests in new ways that we've never been able to do before. So for example, by separating out the individual trees and knowing which species they are, we can start to look at how different species partition space, how different species compete with each other, and how individuals capture light or not in different types of forests. And this helps us to understand how different levels of diversity in forests promote improved carbon sequestration and storage. By tracking individuals from drones, like these images on the right, we can now both detect individual trees and assess their health. So on the top right image here, we've got trees that are suffering different levels of drought, and we can identify them and assess how much the drought is impacting that individual. And on the bottom right here, I've got images of trees that are impacted by ash dieback. And this is somewhere where our drone imagery is not only able to find the individual trees, but also detect the specific impacts of the disease by looking at the patterning of green leaves within a crown, which tend to be much closer to large branches in trees more impacted by ash dieback. So the next phase of this work, as we're starting to move from developing these tools into applying them, is to see how we can maximize the value of the data coming out of these technologies to co-monitor carbon and biodiversity. So in my group, we're really interested in using these technologies not just to do carbon accounting or to do biodiversity monitoring, but to understand how those two really crucial properties of forests go together. And this is an example from my PhD student, Ellie Kent, who's working in the Cairngorms, and she's looking at assessing the effectiveness of different restoration strategies in a very large project, part of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration, which is a run here in Cambridge, looking at how different management strategies allowing natural recolonisation or allowing maturation of old plantations is impacting biodiversity and carbon storage in these Caledonian pine woods. So obviously the work is done by my amazing group, and thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much for that, Emily. It was really interesting and obviously a very important area in our current times to get accuracy. And obviously you can see there's quite an order of magnitude improvement in the detail you can get when you don't have to walk around with a tape measure for every single tree. I'll remind everyone, if you have any questions for Emily, please do post them in the Q&A now. We will be collating them all ready for the Q&A session later on. And then our next speaker in a very different area is Dr Vendruscolo, who is going to tell us all about how he's using AI to help study Alzheimer's disease.
Well, thank you, James. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight and to tell you about our research on Alzheimer's disease and how this has been facilitated by artificial intelligence. See, we work here in Cambridge at the Center for Misfolding Diseases, which exists since about 10 years. And we established the center with the mission of investigating the molecular origins of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer and Parkinson and so on. And in particular, to use this knowledge to develop tools to combat these disorders, which are still largely incurable. So that means drug discovery and diagnostic tools. So I'll focus tonight on Alzheimer's disease, which is really a devastating disorder that robs people progressively from their cognitive functions, and is really affecting over 50 million people worldwide, and is largely incurable. So it has a huge social cost. I just want to give you an idea about how big are these numbers. So compared to other major human diseases like cancer, heart condition, and stroke, is almost equivalent to all the other ones together. These are UK data, but this situation is really similar worldwide. And in comparison, the funding for research in dementia and therefore Alzheimer is minute with respect to the funding for other diseases. And this situation is really reflected in our really poor ability to develop treatments for Alzheimer and related dementias. In fact, almost the entirety of hundreds of clinical trials in the last 30 years have failed. And this is really, again, reflecting on the fact that among all major human disorders, which are all decreasing in terms of incidence or mortality, because of the development of better health care system and therapeutic treatment, Alzheimer is the one which is strongly increasing, and mostly because it is age-related disorder and we have aging population. So really is important to develop new tools for treating this disorder. So at the molecular level, we know since several years, over 3 decades, in fact, that Alzheimer is caused by aberrant deposits of proteins in the brain. So these are typically called amyloid plaques or tangles. So we know that proteins misbehave in Alzheimer. Instead of maintaining their normal shape, they aggregate into deposits which are neurotoxic. And so we would like to prevent the formation of these aggregates made up of proteins, and a typical way is to do drug discovery with small molecules. Now, to give an idea about how drug discovery for proteins with small molecules work, a useful analogy is the lock and key mechanism. You have a key, in this case a small molecule, that fits very well a lock, in this case a protein. So the protein, in other words, it has a particular shape with a pocket, and you can fit a small molecule in the pocket. And this guarantees high affinity and high potency of the drug. So we can apply this also to the proteins associated with Alzheimer's disease. There is a problem, however, and this is really a key problem, that the protein associated with Alzheimer are really not showing any pockets. They are completely disordered. And this is really peculiar of Alzheimer. I think one of the main motivations why we still don't have a widely available therapy for this disorder. So in other words, the problem that we have to face in drug discovery is that there are no binding pockets, there are no locks, in other words, for the keys, and therefore we really don't know what to do. So how do we get out from this situation? Well, we can recognize that binding through this lock and key mechanism is not the only possible way of binding small molecules to proteins. So there are other ways that are largely not described, not investigated. But one way is called disordered binding. In other words, here you have a representation of a small molecule in red that binds a disordered protein in blue. So you see that there is almost a dance of these two molecules together. And despite the fact that there is no stable conformation, the binding is quite tight, and the small molecules is actually able to influence the behavior of the protein. So this looks a very good principle for drug discovery. However, I mean, although this we described this type of binding over 10 years ago, we were stuck for a long time because we didn't really have a systematic way of finding molecules of the type of this red one that binds through this particular mechanism. So we really thought we had the right idea, but we didn't know how to implement it. And the situation changed dramatically a few years ago when artificial intelligence entered into the field of structural biology. And this contribution has been recognized this year with the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and also in part with the Nobel Prize in Physics. And so artificial intelligence gives a very powerful, very accurate tool for predicting the structure of proteins. So we took that a step forward, and we used the AI methods originally developed for predicting the structure of proteins for predicting not the structure this time, but the interaction of small molecules with proteins. And this is a huge, represents a huge change in the field, really a transformative change. To give you an idea, with traditional methods, one could typically, in a typically drug discovery program, screen about 10,000 molecules. With the AI, now we can do easily 10 million, so 3 orders of magnitude more. And what is perhaps even more striking is that the cost has dropped by 3 orders of magnitude, despite having increased by orders of magnitude the number of compounds. So we can, run a drug discovery program with tens of thousands of pounds instead of millions. And the time to do the screening has dropped from months to hours. So it's really a completely changed situation. And this has enabled us to target Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease and other disorders related to the aggregation of disordered proteins. So we have carried out a screen of a very large chemical library for compounds of the type of the red ones that I've described before, and we found several ones. And now we started testing them in preclinical models of Alzheimer's disease. In this case, I'm showing you results in this slide for human cortical neurons. These are neurons in a dish, which are derived from induced pluripotent stem cells. And we can prove that these compounds reduce the amount of these aberrant deposits of proteins in a dose-dependent manner. And they are much more potent than those that have been identified previously. And so with this, really, I wanted to conclude this brief talk by saying that really AI is transforming the field of drug discovery for Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson and other neurodegenerative conditions by offering tools for the systematic discovery of compounds that are targeting the proteins that are associated with disease and causing the neuropathology. With this, I just mentioned that this has been research carried out at the Center for Misfolding Diseases by a fairly large number of people and students and postdocs, and a large network of collaborators worldwide, and really is an interdisciplinary type of research. Really, we have gathered together almost every discipline, spanning from mathematics to medicine, going through physics, chemistry, molecular biology, cell biology, and so on. And thank you all for your attentions.
Thank you very much, Michele. I think it's really exciting to see the order of magnitude change, sort of the step change that's possible when you use these AI tools going on, where you can really dramatically change the way a field works. I think the other really exciting thing to see is the interdisciplinary factor that's coming in with these new tools, where now you need people from all different backgrounds to work on your thing, not just experts in that area, but experts in AI and experts in all sorts of things. Great, so please remember to put your Q&A questions in for Michele. We'll be adding them all into our little sheet ready for the Q&A session at the end. But next and finally, we have Dr. Miles Cranmer, who's going to tell us all about how to do generalist foundation models for science. So we've all seen the power of foundation models for language with playing with ChatGPT, but is it possible to do something exciting like this for the sciences? So, Miles.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be able to share this with you today. So I work on this research collaboration called Polymathic AI. Our mission is basically to train generalist AI models for the sciences, and in doing so, kind of help machine learning get more general kind of understanding of science and data. So I'll talk about this today. So I think in general, machine learning, it's been very successful. I think one of the main problems that we have with machine learning is this problem of unknown unknowns, or I think things that I guess maybe are not in your training data. So there's this classic example where there were deep neural networks trained for detecting pneumonia in hospital patients. And it was discovered that this neural network was not, so it was trained, really accurately to predict pneumonia, but it was later discovered that the neural network was not looking at the lungs at all. It was actually looking at text in the background of the image, because there was basically a token in the image, like someone had written, this patient has pneumonia, and the neural network was just reading that. So this is kind of a major problem with neural networks, is they don't really have common sense. Like they'll do things like this. They'll just completely cheat. They'll pick up on noise in the data. I think this is a major issue that we have with machine learning. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is this recent development in what's called a foundation model. So as you've probably all know, there's this this fantastic new AI called ChatGPT. And I mean, there's this whole ecosystem of tools around large language models, vision models, and these exploit the idea that if you take a very general model and you train it on a massive amount of diverse text and images and code and language, these models will kind of develop general, they'll develop like a stronger intuition for actually processing information. And that's part of why these models are so powerful. So the foundation model approach, the way this works is that you take a very general machine learning model, you pre-train it. So you train it on many, many different tasks. You then take that model and you adapt it to a specific task. In some ways, it kind of mirrors, how education of humans work. We learn very general knowledge, and then we kind of adapt and do specific things. So the way this looks is like this. You have this very general, diverse data set. This all goes into this large foundation model, and then maybe you adapt it to do something specific. Like ChatGPT is specifically tuned to chat with humans. And this is kind of this second adaptation phase. So why does ChatGPT work? I think this graph is interesting. So there's this idea called lexical distance between languages. And so someone who knows English and French will have an easier time to learn Italian. And this is because you kind of pick up, common grammatical concepts, and it makes it easier to learn new languages. So I think a lot of the reason that ChatGPT works so well is because it is just trained on massive amounts of data that actually have a lot of structural patterns between the different languages. So this might be kind of how large language models are able to perform so well. I think it might also be possible in science, and that's kind of where this idea came from. In science, just like in languages, there's shared grammatical structures. In science, there's a lot of shared concepts across disciplines. So, for example, many sciences have this principle of causality, of measurement, of modeling, And so if you have one generalist model that has seen many types of data from all different disciplines, the kind of the hope and hypothesis is that this model will do better at any specific task, just like we've seen for large language models. So you can see this, like if I take the reaction diffusion equation, which is from chemistry, the shallow water equations, which model the behavior of surface water. They both have waves, right? So it's a different system, but they both have this similar phenomenon of waves. So you could think of perhaps this is part of a grammar of partial differential equations. So there's interesting regularities like this across sciences, which I think is kind of why I think this idea will work well. So we created this collaboration, this international research collaboration called Polymathic AI. The purpose of this organization is to build these open source large foundation models for science. So these will be, they'll be downloadable to scientists around the world, and scientists could kind of use these models, use these generalist models to solve specific tasks, but with basically a more powerful AI than if you were to train it from scratch. That's the basic premise. So this is mostly split between University of Cambridge and Flatiron Institute in New York. And we have this shared compute, and we want to kind of train these models at industry scale. We want to build, large foundation models so you can get the same kind of step change in performance. So these are my local members. So these are my students and a postdoc here who've done a great work on this. So I didn't want to scare you, but I thought I could maybe flash one of the architectures we use. This is called an axial vision transformer. We've used models like this to basically build the groundwork for these foundation models. So this model is trained on different physical systems, but it basically puts it in the same input space that it can then process. And because you kind of put all of these different disciplines in the same space, the model gets to kind of exploit patterns across different sciences. So what I want to show you here is kind of a validation of this idea that, if you take an AI model and you train it on many different disciplines, it will do better than a model that was trained on one discipline. So the x-axis here is the amount of data. So this is more data. The y-axis is the error. So lower is better. And what you can see is that the model trained from scratch, you could kind of think of this like a toddler AI. It's never seen anything. It doesn't understand how the world works. It has the worst performance as a function of data. The best model is the model with pre-training. It's seen many different scientific systems, and it requires the least amount of data to perform well at a task. Now, the ones in the middle, these are the surprising ones that we were completely surprised by. These models were trained on general video data, a lot of which actually had things like cat videos in them, because the internet, is a lot of cat videos. So it turns out even pre-training on cat videos helps AI models perform well on specific scientific tasks. And I just wanted to throw in my cat meatball to the presentation. Okay, so this is one of our models. This is very beta. This is essentially a fluid mechanic system that our model has been trained on, and it can predict, highly accurately for many more steps than it's seen during training. So it kind of gives you it gives your AI the ability to kind of go beyond its training data and kind of get more out of the data that it's been given, which is kind of the I think, the main exciting part about these models. So the biggest bottleneck for research in this area is really data. You know, so language data is kind of easy because you can just, you know, scrape the internet, and people have done this and put up data sets. You can download Wikipedia. But if you want your model to, you know, I guess, predict all of these different complex scientific systems, you want to get high quality data. And so this is what we've been really pushing the last year, is data sets. So we have 2 data sets. They're actually coming out this week on Tuesday next week. So one is called The Well. This is this massive data set with a simple format that's basically trained, that lets you train these AI models on many different physics. The point of this is to kind of accelerate the entire field, because we believe really strongly in this idea. And we know that a lot of different, you know, groups around the world are excited about this. So this data set is kind of to push all of us in training this type of model. So I think this data set is going to help us do that. So this is a collaboration with multiple groups at Cambridge and around the world. We also have an astro data set that's called the Multimodal Universe. It's similarly, you know, all of these different types of data in astronomy. It has, you know, 140 million images of galaxies, 4.5 million time series, so different stars. There's also you know, it has this broad class of this broad spectrum of different data types. And so this is also to kind of accelerate the field in approaching multidiscipline AI models, which we think is an exciting research direction. So where do we go from here? I think that, so I'm really excited about this, because I believe strongly in this hypothesis that when you train an AI model on many different disciplines, it will do better at any specific task. So this is most powerful for low data problems. So if you have this, you have some like physical system that you don't really have a good model for, and you want to discover an explanation for this system, this kind of model is really perfect for that, because it has, you know, such a broad understanding of the sciences, that it can kind of use that knowledge, just like, as the name suggests, just like a polymath would, right? So we're very excited about this, and there's exciting things planned for 2025, including the release of our models. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Miles, for that really exciting talk about, you know, possibly what's going to be a really useful tool in the future for sciences, where you'll be able to understand your system by using a model just like ChatGPT. We can use to ask questions. We can ask questions about simulations in physical systems. Right. So thanks to all of our speakers. We'll now move on to the Q&A part of the thing, where we'll try and ask some questions. So if you have questions for Miles, you can quickly put them in. We'll try and go sort of sequentially through the speakers with the specific questions. Then we might have some general questions for the panel that we'll have at the end. Okay, so Emily, we'll do you first. So there was one interesting question from Richard Taylor, which was saying, have you found a consistent difference between your AI tools and your going out and physically measuring a tree with a tape measure, and how do you quantify that kind of error that you might get?
Yeah, so so this has been shown for the technology for these different 3-dimensional scanners, and shown long before we were using AI tools to analyze these data. So these sensors show us that traditional methods massively underestimate the amount of carbon and biomass in individual trees, and that the underestimation, excuse me, is worse for the very largest trees, which are the ones that store the most carbon, that do the most sequestration. So that's been shown for probably a decade and up to around 30%. And the way they did that was they scanned the trees and they chopped down the trees and they weighed every single part of it, which is an extremely intensive process, destructive sampling. And of course, that's not what we want to do. So by knowing that these are very highly accurate methods, what that gives us is the opportunity to then go out and do a lot of scanning instead of cutting things down and develop better ways of generating carbon content. What the AI tools allow us to do is that at a much larger scale. So for many more trees, for many more species, and in many more parts of the world. And that's really crucial for generating better tree hugging methods, so better relationships between what we can measure on the ground and the amount of carbon in trees, because of course, not everybody has access to the kinds of scanners that we do, and it's incredibly important to give the opportunity to monitor land to the people who live there, to landowners, land managers, people, communities who live in forest environments. And these methods are also allowing us to scale up our monitoring, allowing us to do validation for satellite products. So things like NASA's JEDI system, the European Space Agency's biomass mission, which should be launching soon, I hear, because those kinds of sensors are giving us global products about forests, so global products about the amount of carbon held in forests. And so by going to do much higher resolution scanning on the ground, getting much better estimates that we can get with the traditional measures, we're also helping to constrain those global estimates for large-scale monitoring and inputs into things like big climate models.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emily. So another question is, obviously you can scan everything above the ground. Is there any way you can use this to model what might be going on below the ground and root systems and things like that?
Wouldn't that be lovely? Yeah. So most of the sensors the sensors we use rely on the optical part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So from what we can see with our visible eye into sort of the near infrared. And below ground, obviously, we don't see anything. So there are systems that use longer wavelength sensors, ground penetrating radar in particular. So the larger the wavelength, the more likely it is to see something through the ground. But those kinds of technologies are very challenging to apply. Unfortunately, they're also incredibly heavy, so using them in forests is really, really difficult. They're kind of like a massive lawnmower you have to pull across the ground, and you get hit into stumps and hummocks. But I look forward to a new sensor that enables us to do that for sure.
Okay, and so maybe one final question, which is coming, which is using these tools, what kind of throughput do you have? If you wanted to scan a forest, could you do a whole forest, or like what's practical with these new tools?
That's a great question. How many PhD students do you have? No. So it depends on the scanner. So drones fly large areas very rapidly. So we'd be flying multiple hectares within the sort of half-hour battery of a consumer drone. From the ground, there are different types of sensors. So some that stand static on tripods and you move them around, and that gives you very, very high quality data. And there maybe a hectare a day would be pushing it. And then there are others that you can put into a backpack, or you can walk around holding with your hand. And then it's about, how far you can walk. So there's lots of different sensor options. For large scale monitoring, drones are really the most exciting. And we actually, the laser scanners we use on drones are pretty standard, the kind of thing that you find on self-driving cars. Sometimes they're off-the-shelf commercial scanners. So there is the opportunity to fly them at quite large scales. We're typically limited by the battery life of the drones and civil aviation regulations.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so we've now got some questions for you, Michaela. So there was lots of questions about when you use this AI, is there particular parts of the protein that you bind to, or when you do AI, is it entirely general?
All right. Well, that's an important question. Yes. So the turns out that protein aggregation process that leads to the formation of the plaques that I described is quite complex, and this is because it is a kind of chemical reaction in which you start from monomeric proteins which are the reactants, and you end up with amyloid fibrils or the protein deposits, which are the products. and you go through a series of intermediate states. And so the target for drug discovery may be the reactant, which is the initial state, or the product, which is the final state, or it can be something more complicated. It turns out that the final state is catalyzing the aggregation process. So it's a self-replicating process. So the reactant, the products are also the catalyst. So you may decide to target the catalyst, or it turns out that the actual toxic species that are produced during the aggregation reaction are intermediate states. And so you have really, in choosing the target for drug discovery, which is the question is about which part of the protein you should target, really involves a quite complex kinetic analysis, which is possible to carry out with methods that we and others have developed. So it's an important question. It requires a very careful study, and then we can target that with the AI methods, or also traditional methods for that matter. But it's important. So the point that I'm trying to make is that for drug discovery you need a target, and the target involves the choice of the target involves a quite complex series of consideration. Including the region of the protein, but not only.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So there was some other questions about in your lab, when you want to train this, how do you get enough data? And is that a limiting factor in your thing, or?
Well, I should thank Miles, because he has explained how the training really works, right? So it turns out that the methods for predicting the structure of proteins from their sequence, which I've shown in my slides, that are very well established and particularly successful, are trained on typically on the protein data bank, which is a repository of all protein structure ever determined. It's about 200,000 protein structures. Turns out that this size of the data of the data is sufficient to learn the language of protein interactions, or amino acids interaction, which are the building blocks. So we can build on this training and extend it to interaction with small molecules. But it turns out that the data set that you need to learn interactions to extend the training, as Miles very clearly explained, you need less data. So we have much less knowledge of protein small molecule interactions, about 1 order of magnitude less than for protein structure, but this is sufficient to make accurate prediction of protein small molecule interactions, or for that matter, also for protein-protein interactions. So what I mean is that the language of molecular interaction can be learned in modules, so to speak. And here I just refer to what Miles has explained.
Excellent. And then the natural and most popular question we had for you was, have you found anything that may be seen as a successful treatment or as a possible cure for Alzheimer's using this method? What are your current, most exciting candidates?
Yes, I mean there are already 3 approved therapies for Alzheimer in the US, in China, and Japan. In the UK there is 1, and these are all antibodies. So molecules that are part of our immune system that have been developed to target amyloid plaques. So they all have the same mechanism of action. So our goal is to reproduce this mechanism of action with small molecules. And our molecules are not in the clinic, they are in the preclinical development. So in order to answer the question that you mentioned, so when there will be a therapy for Alzheimer, I mean, in some sense, there are already therapies for Alzheimer's. They are not, they are available, but not widely. And there are side effects due to various technical problems with antibody treatments. But they have opened the way by showing a mechanism of action that can work, and this is what we are replicating with small molecules. So it's a matter, I think, of progressive improvement in our ability to develop drugs. I mean, an analogy that is useful is the development of treatment for cancer, right? In the 1970s, when the first treatment came out, were very not very effective, but in the course of several decades, they become increasingly potent. And so we should expect a similar situation. The first drug for Alzheimer are becoming available, and in the next 5, 10, 20 years, they will be increasing in efficacy.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michaela. So now some questions for you, Miles. So the first question is, you're obviously training this on lots of simulations, which means that we probably understand some of the dynamics already. So is there a risk in training it on all this thing that we know that we'll miss, novel or unexpected patterns when we apply it to new data?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, I mean, maybe more succinctly, you could say, if our training data is wrong, will our model be biased towards the wrong answer? So I think the cat video example is actually a really kind of effective way to test this. I mean, so you take the model, you pre-train it on general video data, and it does better on the physics prediction task than if you had trained from scratch. So I think really what that tells you is you can have a bad or kind of unrelated starting point, but if you tune your model to, say, the real data that has this unknown physics, you will kind of always be assisted by the pre-training step. So even if your pre-training data is wrong, it's still helpful to use it. That's why, all these large language models, they're trained on the entire internet. There's a lot of, terrible things on the internet that are still in the training set. You can tune the model to kind of not use that part of the data, and not be, very toxic like many people are on the internet. But the data is still useful because it informs things like the understanding of grammar, for example. So I think it's, in many ways, it's similar here. And I think you do want to pre-train on the physics that might be wrong, because it helps the model in picking up the unknown parts, because it's already learned the parts that we do know. So it doesn't have to worry about those parts. It can just focus on learning the differences. It can focus on learning the unknown part of the physics.
Excellent. So that answered the other question, which was what are cat videos really telling us? I guess is the answer simply that cat videos contain causal dynamics, and they contain...
Yeah, I mean, so this is a really interesting research topic. So actually my PhD student, who just started a couple of months ago, she's going to explore this problem, which is, why does pre-training on general video data help neural networks make predictions about complex physics systems that are not directly related to the video data? Like, is it something really simple, like when we initialize neural networks, the initialization that we use is bad, so you train on anything and it just puts the neural network in a better space? It could be something simple like that, or it could be a really deep reason, like there's causal spatiotemporal relations in this video data that actually does help your model make predictions better. Yeah, so one question that so Terry Tao was at a talk on Polymathic, and he asked this really interesting question. If you train the model on cartoon physics, like if you train the model on cartoons, would that also help? Because if you think about, animated cartoons, a lot of the time they don't have the same physics that we have, right? So I think it's a really interesting question. Like, what part of training on general video data is actually helping the model? And this is actually related to modern topics in language model research, where people are interested in seeing what's the right proportion of language data sets. So like how much percent of your steps should be on Wikipedia versus Reddit comments or other things. So I think we have to answer the same question, but for physics. We need to say, if I'm going to use this model on such and such task, what's the right mix of physics to kind of give my model a good intuition? Because we also can't train the model on everything. There's just so much data out there. We literally cannot train the model on all the data we have. It's just too much. So yeah, so these questions are really exciting research topic.
Okay, so one final question for you, which has come from a couple of people, which is that you train these foundation models, they help you run simulations, but how do you gain mathematical understanding as to what's actually happening in these systems, or is it just a way of modeling things better?
Yeah, so this is another interesting research topic, the interpretability part of it. So there's so as an example, there is this physical system that we're looking at currently where simulations and experimental data are completely different, and we don't know why. And this has kind of plagued the field for 30 years, and nobody can figure out what's wrong with simulations. What we can do with this foundation model, pre-train the model on simulations, which we know are kind of incorrect. That data gives the model a really good base for predictions. Take that model, tune it to real data, which of course has the correct physics because it's the real world. And then we can probe the model and see what exactly is it looking at in the input. Is it looking at the initial conditions of this physical system? Is it looking at, every step? It's looking at like individual pixels. And that actually tells us a lot about the physics. So this will kind of, not only will it help us speed up simulations, but it can also help us, make discoveries about physics, like fundamental physics models for systems.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. So now we have squeeze in one or two very general questions for the panel so people can jump in as they feel qualified to answer. So I guess the first one is, if we want to use AI in science, how do we wrestle with the problems of trustworthiness and reliability in the AI that we use?
Well, I think in our discipline, in my discipline, we don't have loads of data, and it's quite specialist data. So we share data, we share code, we try to replicate what others have done to really understand the extent to which we can trust the results. I'm also really interested in where the models go wrong. So the example of identifying trees, for example, if the model is confusing two trees, is that because those are genetically closer to each other? I think there's things that we can learn from the errors that these tools are making that are quite exciting and might actually give us some new insights into the systems that we study.
Excellent. Okay, so then let's as we're running up to time, let's finish with one slightly light-hearted question, which is about the future of AI. Whatever a worry is about, is if these models get good, who do we lose first? Do we lose PhD students? Do we lose postdocs? Do we lose professors? Or how does this affect the way we do research and the kind of people we need to employ?
Maybe, yeah, I could answer. I mean, I think I think that we'll constantly have this shift in terms of what can and can't be automated. And I think some things, the easy parts of this job will be able to, like, we can automate those, but we can't do the more sophisticated things. Yeah, I mean, I think that AI in general, like I'm just excited about it as a way of making people, making individuals kind of more effective in accomplishing their goals, because it really gives you a way to do more things as a single person. Which is, I mean, there's many analogies you can make to computing, right? Like computing, I think that AI is going to be as widespread, if not more widespread, than computing is right now in the sciences and in industry. I think AI is just going to, be involved in every part of the process, for better or for worse. And I think that similar to computing, it just gives it lets anybody be more productive and kind of put their time into things that are difficult to automate, like the maybe the creative side of things. Yeah, so that's kind of what I think. But yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say what specifically will. Yeah, I hope I don't lose my job, basically.
Excellent. And on that point, that we all hope we don't lose our jobs to AI, I will thank Emily and Michaela and Miles. And I think we can see that AI is really changing things quite dramatically. There's quite a step change often in a lot of the sciences with the tools that we can do. And I think we'll see some really exciting things coming up. We've already seen 2 Nobel Prizes this year go out for AI and science. And I think we'll probably see many more in the future as this matures and becomes more widely used. So thank you all for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it and it was engaging and interesting for you. There will be more webinars, so please listen out for that in the coming weeks in your inboxes for invitations to our Lent term series. And otherwise, I'll say thank you very much and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.